Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. Today, we'll be looking at the Canon M6 Mark II, the swan song of the Canon EFM system. All right, I know. Technically, the M50 Mark II was the last camera released for the EFM line, but that was a pretty minor update to the M50, where the M6 Mark II was pretty cutting edge, packed with Canon's latest and greatest APS-C sensor. So I think it is a better swan song for the system than the M50 Mark II. With that, let's have a look why. What is the Canon M6 Mark II? Well, it's this camera right here. It is a APS-C sensor-equipped mirrorless camera. It was released in August of 2019, and the sensor in it is Canon's 32.5 megapixel dual pixel enabled sensor. And of course, it's a CMOS, being Canon and whatnot. The ISO range of the camera is between 100 and 25,600, with the boost bringing it up to 51,200 ISO. The M6 II can do shutter speeds from 30 seconds all the way up to 1/4000th of a second with its mechanical shutter, or up to 1/16,000th with the electronic. It uses the Digic 8 image processor and is capable of shooting at 14 frames per second with its mechanical shutter. It'll do 30 FPS with a crop and electronic shutter only in its own special little mode, which we'll talk about later. All of this is backed up by that dual pixel autofocus system, granting up to 5,481 selectable points, covering 88% of the frame this way and 100% of the frame this way. This may or may not be a bit less depending on the lens that you have on it, but you don't need to worry about it because the camera will switch and do whatever it's got to do automatically. Metering is covered by a 384 zone system using the sensor, and you may have noticed, but this camera does not have an EVF built in. But you may have also noticed a hot shoe mounted EVF can be fitted, which is what I've done. Being a modern camera, the M6 II can take 4K video. It's also uncropped, and the dual pixel autofocus does work in 4K video recording mode. The back of the camera has a 3.04-inch display featuring 1.04 million dotties. It is also a touchy-touch screen, so you can do touch manipulation. The camera is powered by the LPE17 battery, and in its eco mode, you can get 410 shots, or not in eco mode, 300-ish shots, SEPA rated, of course. Now, the camera does have some other convenient features, like USB-C charging, but only on PD-enabled chargers. With the battery and a memory card, the M6 II comes in at 408 grams. When the camera was released, its MSRP was $849 USD. I really miss the sub 1K mid-tier cameras. Although I may eat those words with the inflation calculation. Right. With inflation of $26, it's a little over at 1,070 USD, or just under 1,490 Canadian buccarinos. Death of the EFM mount. I imagine that in 2018, when Canon unveiled all the RF mount things, it might have shaken up the world for Canon shooters. Having two mirrorless mounts was weird. There was probably a tiny bit of reprieve when the RF mount cameras that came out were all full frame cameras. Because at least to me, I thought that maybe at the time when Canon was doing this, they were just going to run with two mounts. One mount, EFM for APS-C, and one mount, RF for full frame. I don't know what their plan would have been, but I thought maybe Canon did have some sort of magical grand plan for both mounts. And this was a little bit reinforced when in 2019, the M6 Mark II was released. And it seemed like a pretty big release too, because it looked like they had jammed the 90D sensor into a compact camera. And that sensor was Canon's APS-C flagship sensor, plopped in a pretty teeny tiny body. And I thought, again, this might have been Canon doubling down and having two mounts, showing how serious they were with APS-C and EFM. But in hindsight, this kind of felt like the swan song. Even though there were two other EFM cameras released, the M200 and the M50 Mark II, but as I mentioned earlier, these two cameras felt more like minor updates of previous versions, since they featured the same 24 megapixel sensor that debuted on the EFM system with the M5 in 2016, which was many years prior to this. And that itself was a sensor that debuted on the Canon 80D earlier in 2016. And it was kind of weird because then after that, it was crickets for the EFM system till 2023, when Canon officially stated EFM was being discontinued. I admit there were some signs from 2018 to 2023 that things weren't going so well for EFM. For example, Canon didn't release a single EFM lens in that period, and even more of a sign that EFM might have been done for was that the release of the R7 and R10 in 2022 meant that RF mount also had APS-C cameras. So that kind of really put the nail in the coffin there. At any rate, EFM is dead, yet here I am, still using an M6 Mark II. So let's move on. Operation and feel. The M6 II has what I think is one of the best control layouts for a compact camera. This is, I think, what small mirrorless cameras should all strive to be. Let's go over why. Let's first talk about command dials. This has effectively about 2.5 of them. You have the one here. This is the one around the shutter button. You also have one just behind where your thumb is, right there. And you got this D-pad combo thingy, which kind of is half a command dial. That's a lot of dials. But dials are no good if they aren't well placed and easy to use. But on the M6 II, it is well placed and easy to use. The front dial, as I said, surrounds the shutter, and it has a good resistance, good clickiness to it, and overall is just a nice feeling control that is in a natural spot for your index finger to reach. The rear is just behind the shutter button command dial, and it again is placed in a way that is perfect for a thumb to just reach up and give it a twist. Its size is also pretty good, with enough texturing going up the dial that, again, thumb control is pretty good. As well as this thing has Canon's dual function button thingy, which allows you to use the command dial in an extra way. By pressing the dual function button, you can quickly use your command dials to toggle through other things. Pretty neat. Now, you might have also noticed that practically all of the camera's controls are on the right side, and that's great. Literally, the only thing on the left side of the camera is this here, and that is the latch for the pop-up flash. boop, there you have it. On a related note, the power switch might be the best implementation that I've seen for a compact mirrorless camera to this date that I have used. It is just underneath the rear thumb command dial. And by putting it there, it freed up space to make what I think is the normal second natural location for a power switch, the switch that's normally around the ye olde shutter button. But without that, it is pretty good being placed up here. It's a button or a switch that can be easily done with your index finger, or it can be flipped on and off with your thumbsies. Let's see. On, off, on, off. Awesome possum. On top of that, the M6 II is very well built. It has a quite solid grip. It's reasonably substantial, as you can see, and it actually comfortably fits all of my fingies. Additionally, the rear thumb perch is right here, and it's also in a great spot. Although you might have noticed one thing is missing from this control layout. One thing is not on this camera from Canon's control layout library, and that is, of course, the AF joystick. Although I personally think it can be forgiven given the camera's size, and it is partially made up by the fact that you can get used to doing AF controls or AF point placement using the quite excellent touch screen. Apparently I can't words very good today. It has very excellent touchscreen controls. And let's get into that as well. It is a fairly standard affair at this point, but if you are not aware, as per Canon tradition, touchscreen stuff is something they're pretty good at. On the M6 II, you can basically navigate the entire menu with the touchscreen. As you can see here, you can literally touch and tap menu options, enter and dive, and move around in the menu. It is pretty good. Additionally, you can do things like touch to focus, and you can do touch shutter if you'd like, and it also supports multi-touch pinch zoom kind of thingies, and that's pretty good. And on the topic of menus, it's Canon, so it's pretty good. You have your standard Canon stuff. It is color-coded. There are tabs on the top and pages, tabs and pages, as well as scrolling through the options going down. It is honestly a good system. Additionally, on the M6 II, this menu is before things got really complicated, so there isn't a tab for a bajillion million AF options. So that is nice. It is a menu that is straightforward, easy, color-coded, and not hugely cluttered with different options. There's also a pretty reasonable amount of customization that you can have on the controls, despite the kind of limited number of controls. With that, of course, the excess number of command dials, which is always great. But let's pivot to the screen. The M6 II screen unfortunately doesn't articulate. It does tilt though, so it is good as a photocentric display. It does do things like this. It can pull out, do things like that. But if you want to do a bit of vloggy, it also does things like this. Folds all the way up. But that being said, if you have an EVF like I have, it cannot fold up out of the way of the EVF. You will get blockages. So you'll have to remove the EVF if you do want to do some of that vlogginess. Let's talk about some of the convenience features that the M6 II has. The M6 II has USB-C charging. It is on the right side of the camera, and there it is, a USB-C port. At the time when this was released, It was a bit of a sticking point that the chargers that could work with the M6 II had to be PD chargers. But in 2026, I assume at this point, every single person now has a PD capable charger. And at this point, I'm not going to really say it's a fault of the camera. I'm going to say it was ahead of its time. And I really do love this feature. USB-C charging is very convenient. Next, this camera does have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And again, this is something I think Canon is surprisingly pretty good at implementing. It is by far the best app for remote shooting, picture transfer that I've used in a bit. That being said, I primarily end up using Sony's old stuff, and that is quite terrible. And I do hear that the new Sony app is quite good, but I don't have a camera that works with it. But back to the M6 II, the Canon app seems to be fairly good. It is pretty responsive. The connection seems fairly quick to establish, and you actually get to do a considerable amount of controls on your phone if you're doing remote shooting. Overall, when it comes to the M6 II, generally, handling on this thing is awesome. Looking at it, it really does seem like when they did the M6 II, the Canon cripple hammer was on vacation. Right before we move on though, I do want to touch on the design of the M6 II. I personally think this is one of the best camera designs in the EOS M line in general. And in general, I think with that line of cameras, Canon did a lot of experimentation with different variations, and a lot of them were actually quite good. But I do think the M6 II is the best of the best. Without the EVF, it is just a beautifully clean look. And I'm a bit sad that this camera isn't being replicated on the RF line of cameras. You can kind of see hints of it in the R50V, but I still think the M6 II/M6 looks better. Image quality and autofocus. The M6 II features a very dense APS-C sensor. When it comes to resolution, really the only sensor with more density than this is the 40 megapixel unit that you currently see in the current crop of Fujifilm cameras. I don't think there's another APS-C sensor that is otherwise as dense as this or the 40 megapixel unit. So this camera does have the ability to output very detailed images. But as far as I remember, for all Canon sensors, or most of them, I believe, there is still an AA filter over the sensor, albeit a very weak and very, very well tuned one. The sensor itself, the one in this camera, is a very traditional front-side illuminated sensor. There's no stacking, there's no other fancy techniques like backside illumination. There's no fanciness to allow the sensor to have increased fill factor or turbo high read speeds. Those benefits that those other techniques tend to give more modern sensors. And it does show a little bit. Although not a huge amount, it is still an excellent sensor. But I do want to remind you that the M6 II does not have IBIS. Canon was very late to the game. And combine that with the fairly relatively high resolution / pixel dense sensor, and I personally noticed that with this camera, I really needed to have pretty high shutter speeds to get sharp images. At the time of recording, my minimum shutter set for this camera, and before the ISO kicks up, is 1/250th. A lot of the times, I find myself shooting at speeds that or higher, because if I go any lower, I do find that I would need to fire a couple shots just to make sure I wasn't getting sensor or camera shake. So yes, this camera doesn't have IBIS, and you do have to compensate with some increased shutter speeds, which might not be the worst thing, which we'll get into a little bit later. At the moment though, fun fact, this is the highest pixel density camera that I own yet. So maybe the shaky images problem that I'm having with the shutter speeds, it's just me not being so used to such a pixel dense camera. When it comes to dynamic range, the M6 II does a pretty good job. This camera is post Canon lethargy era. Despite being a traditional front side illuminated sensor, it packs a solid punch when it comes to dynamic range, especially when you consider the resolution that's coming in with this camera. The dynamic range is only a little bit worse than contemporary sensors of its time. But before we comment on that and noise, let's have a look at some samples of noisage. Before we move on to noise, let's first have a look at some samples of said noise. When it comes to noise, I'm quite happy with the performance of this camera as well. Honestly, it's pretty in line with the 24 or 26 megapixel sensors of the era, which is pretty impressive, again, given the resolution boosty. For this camera, I'm personally pretty happy shooting at ISO 6400 or 12,800 in a pinch, with a little bit of noise reduction sprinkled in post. All right. Autofocus time. Canon's dual pixel is in here. There's a lot of them. And it is a very, very good system for stills. Still, to this day, this system is quite good. It's very quick. In its traditional modes, like your spot mode, it is very good, very fast, and it offers a very reliable, predictable autofocus solution. It also has some of the more advanced modes that you come to expect from mirrorless cameras that are pretty modern. Face and eye detection, they're a thing, and I found them fairly good on this camera. Additionally, tracking algorithms for this, for just arbitrary subject tracking, I found to be pretty solid, although they're not as complex as modern AF systems. So if there are multiple subjects or a kind of tricky background, the system itself can lose the subject that you're tracking on. However, if it's a fairly easy scenario, like one person or whatnot, the camera will have a pretty easy time picking up on their face, and if they get close enough, sticking to the closest eyeball. And again, with this dual pixel system, you can do a tap on an arbitrary subject and just let the camera try to follow it. Again, it generally will do a pretty good job when it comes to arbitrary objects on relatively simple scenarios where there's a lot of separation between it and the background, but I did find it wasn't as flawless as modern systems where you could basically point the camera, tap, and it'll never lose it. If the subject turns weird or if it is too close to the background, you will see that the system does struggle a bit, but overall it is leaps better than traditional DSLR AF systems for tracking. It is able to generally track fast action, and if you're going to do that though, I do recommend using the EVF for it, since when doing so, chances are you're going to be probably using a bigger, heavier lens, doing fast action-y thingies, and the M6 II isn't the most balanced camera for those kind of lenses, so having the EVF will keep the camera close to your face and generally help with stability. And all this talk about good AF is nice because this camera has a pretty high FPS. With the mechanical shutter, it is able to do an eye-watering 14 FPS, with the priority being shooting speed. And if you don't want to prioritize shooting speed but prioritize AF, it does drop down to 7 FPS over just pure burst speed. But there is also a super duper mode where you can get 30 frames per second. It also does AF in this mode, but here's the thing. When you use this mode, it is not in the drive mode. It is in its own separate mode. It is electronic shutter only. The bit depth drops from 12 bits from 14, and there's a crop, 25%. And that leaves you with roughly an 18 megapixel image. And the way that it saves the files, you need a program that is able to open these special little weird files. So there are caveats to using that high-speed 30 frame per second mode. But if you do want to use it and you have a fast enough card, it'll apparently let you buffer 80 shots. And this camera has 0.5 seconds worth of pre-buffering in this mode. So you get shots before and after you press the shutter. Personally, I don't really care for such modes. I don't really do fast action anymore. But I can appreciate that it's there, and it's a pretty cool feature overall. And I think it is a useful feature for sports and fast action photography. With that, let's have a listen at that mechanical shutter. Oh boy. That's nuts. Not really sure if it came through, but the M6 II is actually pretty loud for a mirrorless camera. I do think that with the high-speed 14 FPS shooting, you don't really notice all the loudness that much, but in its lower speeds, I kind of do. Here. I don't mind this noise, but there is a bit of a concern. The shutter, you can feel it more than a DSLR. I do also find that it is more noticeable than other mirrorless cameras like my A7 II. I'm not sure if that alone is enough to increase the camera shake of images, but it's worth noting if you are concerned. But I also tend to bias my shutter speeds fairly high since I'm worried about shutter shake. So I take, not shutter shake, my shake when it comes to getting sharp images. So I'll take high ISO over shaky images. But we will talk about shutter shake since that is also a thing with this camera. The shutter of the camera is actually quite loud. I think the burst kind of helped mute that a bit. So let's actually do some slower shooting so you can give it a listen. It is surprisingly loud for a mirrorless camera, although not the loudest that I've had. That being said, if you are worried about loud shutters, you can switch to the electronic shutter mode, although, again, this is a front-side illuminated sensor. It's got pretty high resolution, so you might need to take into account some rolling shutter and or put it on a tripod, or also just shoot relatively static things if you do need to use the electronic shutter. But we need to talk about something else about this camera. Shutter shock. While we're here, I thought we should talk about this. There was quite a bit of confusion when this camera came out. There's reporting that the camera shutter is purely, the mechanical bits were a purely mechanical shutter, and that seems to be the case. But to be fair, there were reasons to maybe believe that it was or wasn't, because Canon's website isn't the clearest on what's actually in this camera. Just to give you a snippet from Canon's own website, the description of the M6 II's shutter is under the features button on the webpage, and it reads like so. The EOS M6 Mark II camera features a powerful electronic shutter system with speeds from 1/16,000th and a mechanical slash electrical first curtain shutter with a maximum of 1/4000th of a second. Not only is this effective at freezing high-speed action, but the EOS M6 Mark II can help capture a once-in-a-lifetime moment in sharp detail. Based on that, you would assume that it has electronic first curtain shutter, right? But then we get to the specs page and things are weird. If you scroll down and you try to look for information on the shutter, it doesn't talk about electronic first curtain at all. And it says this: mechanical bracket first, or mechanical bracket mechanical first and second curtain, which implies the shutter in here is purely mechanical for both. It's a bit weird. Anyways, I'll link to the Canon page on the M6 Mark II, although who knows when that'll be changed into its Canon Museum spot, and this link may be dead by the time or whenever you look at this. But for now, it is active in 2026, the early parts of it. But there were other things or other sources, other people that tested the M6 II's shutter and kind of confirmed whether or not there is electronic first curtain or purely mechanical shutters, there appears to be a shutter shock problem. And it does seem to imply that the shutter in here is a purely mechanical one without electronic first curtain, which would normally help address shutter shock, apparently at these lower speeds where shutter shock is most evident on this camera. I'll put the link to the articles and videos I found on this topic, but it does generally seem to imply that around 1/115th and 1/200th of a second are the shutter speeds that are most impacted by shutter shock. So if you are using those speeds a lot, you may notice that the image quality is not as good as it should be. And so it seems that by pure chance, my decision to limit my shutter speeds to above 1/250th might have saved me from this, because I really didn't notice it while shooting this, but I did have someone in the comments ask about this when I mentioned that I had an M6 Mark II. So if you are someone who does shoot in these shutter speeds, beware. This seems to affect a lot of specifically cheaper lenses that have image stabilization. It does still show up on non-image stabilized lenses, but it seems to be a much smaller, almost non-issue on these other lenses. It appears to be something that has to do with the way the cheaper IS-enabled lenses lock/fix position of those IS elements when the system is turned off. Additionally, even lenses with image stabilization, if they're turned on, the system may be susceptible to the shutter shock, irrespective of whether or not it's on or off, and whether or not it is a cheap IS system or a not cheap IS system. Either way, if you're using this camera with an IS-enabled lens and it is on and you're using it within those shutter speeds, the shutter shake might be to the point where the system cannot compensate for it at those speeds at all. Thus, you will notice a degradation in image quality. There seems to be a lot to it, so I'm kind of just abbreviating things. Again, have a look at the articles and the various videos in the link in the description below. They go through it in much more detail. All right. With all of that, before we get into the sample gallery, I want to remind people that there is now a Flickr up, and for this review, the images in the sample gallery, some or most of them will be in that Flickr account. So I'll put a link in the description below as well. Maybe a card here. All right, let's have a look at the gallery. Video mode. Being a pretty modern mirrorless camera, despite the deadness of the system, the M6 II does shoot 4K. Now, it isn't oversampled, it isn't binned. It appears to be line skipped. Dun dun dun. Either way, apparently this means that the footage isn't as nice as other cameras that do employ oversampling or pixel binning, or some combination thereof. It is also going to generally be noisier than cameras that do those techniques. However, I personally found that the 4K on this camera is pretty good. And at the time that this was released, it was the most capable 4K camera that Canon was able to deliver on its mirrorless cameras. Remember, it has both dual pixel autofocus in 4K video recording, and it will allow you to record video using the full width of the sensor. Neither of which are available on 4K with the M50 Mark II. The camera can also handle some slow-mo, offering HD up to 120 frames per second. Although in that mode there is no autofocus and audio is not recorded either. But this isn't really a thing that I do, so I'm largely ignoring it. But the option is there. And personally, for me, I think the 4K out of the M6 II is pretty good. It is good for stuff like this YouTube stuff. The AF on the M6 II in video really is the star of the show. It offers really solid tracking, and it's able to transition pretty smoothly between subjects. The only thing it's really missing is the IBIS. It does do digital stabilization though, which incurs a bit of a crop, with two specific digital IS modes. Standard, which incurs a little crop, and enhanced, which incurs a lot of crop. So I don't use either. If possible, I try to shoot video on this camera with a lens with image stabilization. But let's have a look at the video samples. Hello. Welcome to the EOS M6 Mark II video sample. We're using the on-board microphone. We're going to be testing the AF performance. Currently using the 22mm f2 STM. We are shooting wide open. I have face and eyeball tracking turned on. I'm just out of frame, and let's fix that. It's slightly cold. All right. Seems to be doing a pretty good job. I think we'll call it there. Recommendation and conclusion. This camera is hard to recommend. Despite how much I actually like this camera, I like it a lot. And the lack of recommendation is exacerbated by the fact that the EFM system never had a huge library of lenses to begin with, and they're not going to be adding any more now since it's discontinued. Additionally, you would be hard-pressed to find even third-party lenses for it, since there were just a handful that were ever made, I think by Sigma and Viltrox. Generally, at this point, for crop mirrorless systems, if you're looking for Canon, you're kind of better off just generally hopping into the RF system bandwagon, since that appears to be here to stay. The M6 Mark II really, I think, only makes sense if you're content with the limited lens offerings. It might be a good way to help reduce your gas. I mean, didn't reduce mine. I'm still buying random cameras left, right, and center. But nothing to do with the M6 II. That's just me. I have a problem here. But again, if you're content with the limited lens offerings or planning to use adapted EF lenses or other adapters, then the EFM system might still make sense. I personally do use adapted EF glass, and I use the cheap, newer adapter. It seems to work pretty well. Additionally, the other adapters for EFM, they're really cheap. So if that's something that's an option to you, these systems or this camera might still make sense. But another reason why I think it's hard to kind of recommend this is cost. It is a bit spendy for what you're getting, and what you're getting is this camera at around 550 USD. Admittedly, this is still cheaper than what it costs to get the 90D, so if you are just curious about the sensor, the M6 Mark II is the cheapest way to get it. With the next cheapest being the 90D, and with the most expensive being the R7, I think. And if you are going to get the M6 Mark II, I would recommend getting it with the EVF. There is the DC1 and the DC2 EVF. Both have the same resolution, but if you want something kind of weird, the DC1 can tilt up and down. This one is the DC2, it can't do that. And both of them seem to be around the same price. You can generally find them for around 100 to 130 US dollars. But I will say, if you just want an everyday compact camera and you aren't concerned with the whole interchangeable lens aspect, I actually think the M6 Mark II with this 22mm f2 and an EVF make for a really nice compact setup. Overall though, I just really wish that Canon would bring back this body style and swap it over to RF mount. It'd be great, and I would be tempted to buy one of them new if they did that. It's probably not going to happen though. Anyways, this video was longer than I thought, even for me. But I'm curious. Let me know what your thoughts are on the M6 Mark II. Did the shutter shock affect you? What are your thoughts about the EFM system in general? Before we actually do the wrap-up bit, that's the other thing that makes this harder to recommend. If you are someone that does tend to land in those shutter speeds, yeah, that shutter shock problem is interesting. Not good interesting, just interesting. No, bad interesting. All right, with that, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.